Oh, welcome into another episode. I'm glad I've got my voice this morning. I just got back from a bachelor party in Nashville, and let me tell you, the 5-day bender, coming back to life here today. This is a good way to transition back into real life here.
That sounds, at our age, I don't know. I don't think I could do it again.
Right. I've got a returning guest on the show today, Katie Ganoe, coming back. You were here to talk Otter Cove at one point in time. Your time with them is done, and now you've kind of on to this new position. I'm interested in hearing about that. We'll talk about that transition a little bit and how you ended up with this current opportunity. But welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking it's been 2 years. I remember it was right after I came back from maternity leave.
Wow.
And he just turned 2. So it's been 2 years.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
That is
wild?
crazy. Time continues to go. That's crazy.
I know.
Yeah, I'm really excited here. I'm just excited to kind of get into a conversation about something that doesn't really affect me at all as a single person with no kids, but childcare is a super divisive topic, very hard on families, certainly families that are together, but single moms even harder, and the challenges that are faced with that. So we're going to get into maybe the little bit of the history of childcare, how some things have been affected with policies that we've made. There's been a certain amount, lots of policies that have been made throughout time that have affected how workforce participation, and then not just that, but how hard it is to open a daycare facility too, or open a childcare facility. All those things, challenges that are, Minnesota is one of the toughest states to open a childcare facility in. So maybe you have some insight on that, or as to why. But yeah, just overall, you had mentioned you wanted to come back on the show and talk about this topic. So before we get into, I have an agenda here I'd like to go through. But what are you hoping to get out of this with spreading this message or coming on for this conversation?
Yeah, really just to share the work that is happening. I think childcare is not new. It's not a new issue. It's not a new conversation at the city level or the county level. But I think those of us in the field have not always done a great job of sharing that work really broadly. We talk about it kind of within the early childhood community, but really wanting to bring it out to the community more, because it is a community issue, and it affects you. You don't have kids, but childcare affects you in a lot of ways. And so just wanted to let people know the work that is happening, partnership opportunities. There's kind of some momentum happening again. Just want to spread the word of what is happening around childcare, specifically in Fergus Falls, but also Otter Tail County. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to hear about it. I'm excited to, I've obviously dug through some of this stuff on just overall childcare, things for research purposes here, but I'm excited about maybe some specifics that are happening in Fergus Falls with that sort of stuff, and maybe some insight about that. So talk a little bit about, obviously it's been 2 years. You had your child is growing up now. I talked to Nick a little bit. I haven't had a chance to get him on, but I know he's obviously been through some stuff with the cutting back of stuff in Fergus. So you guys' family has been affected in that way. Talk about that a little bit, just like a whirlwind of stuff, transition. You just started a new job.
Yeah. Our whole life is, I don't know, upside down, but we're fine. We're fortunate. We moved back to Fergus specifically because our families are here. So we have family support as we figure out what our next steps are. As Nick figures out his new career, whatever that might look like, who knows? It's been a lot of transition.
And so your time at Otter Cove, you got this opportunity. How did that all come to be?
Yeah, so I've been part of kind of this childcare work the past few years through a contract position I have with West Central Initiative. So I lead the Otter Tail County Early Childhood Initiative, which is a countywide group of stakeholders focusing on early childhood, not just childcare, but that's part of that work. And so I've just been connected with folks doing that work while I was at Otter Cove. And then it just the time came for a transition. I was just, I think, had kind of reached the limit of what I could do at Otter Cove, or reached the limit of maybe my skills and what the organization needed. And so then this opportunity with some contract work came up. And actually the timing was kind of perfect. The same week I was done at Otter Cove was also the week we lost childcare for our youngest. And so I've also been staying home part-time these last few months because we didn't have childcare for him.
Oh,
yeah. So it's kind of, which we have childcare.
It's kind of the irony of the conversation we're about to have.
Yeah.
Huh? Okay.
Yeah. And so he's come with me to meetings and he's been on calls because that's just, what we've had to do. So I've had that personal connection to the work too, but I got my start in childcare. That's really how I entered the workforce, was in childcare. So it feels good to be back doing that work. I had to step away for a little bit because it's exhausting work.
Did you run a daycare at one point? Or
I didn't run one, but I was the lead teacher and I was an assistant director.
Okay.
Up in Fargo. Okay. And then I worked for an organization called Childcare Aware, which is like a support organization. So I provided training for childcare providers for about 7 years. And then moved to Otter Cove for a little bit and then now back to the childcare world. So I've had experience kind of as a parent, as a consumer, but also as a provider, and kind of a, technical assistance support person too. So I've got lots of experience from all different levels with childcare.
So your position with West Central Initiative was in place while you were working with Otter Cove. You were kind of in that position. And then the contracts with the city and the county opened up and just sort of played in well to what you were already doing.
Yeah. Yep. So the city childcare project manager position had been open for a while actually, and they hadn't had any applicants. And then just kind of the timing of it worked out for me to apply for it and to step into that role. The county has had childcare project managers for a couple of years now. They've had 2, and one of them is rolling off. And so then it opened up another position at the county. So I stepped into that as well. Yeah, they just all kind of worked out perfectly.
So and you can talk to me a little bit more about, I guess, what you do. You oversee childcare initiatives in our county and city now, or how does that work?
It's pretty broad and I'm still kind of figuring it out. Broadly, both positions, the goal is to support childcare, whether that's recruiting new providers, whether it's supporting current providers with, connecting them to resources, or maybe there's grant opportunities. I just had someone reach out for some help with writing a grant. And also a big part of my work, particularly with the city, is bringing together community partners and looking at how can the community support childcare, whether that's through starting new childcare programs, within a business, or maybe a business sponsors spots in a childcare program, like identifying some of those solutions. So that's a big part of my work with the city right now, is bringing together those partners to figure out, like, how do we as a community support childcare in a more holistic way. I think that it's often really siloed work and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And so trying to bring people together, it's like we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So like, how do we get on the same page about moving some of that forward? So it's pretty broad work. But there's plenty of it. There's lots to do. So
yeah, obviously some of the big issues you have, the childcare, like the simply lack of childcare. There's certain areas where childcare just is not available. There's just not enough of it. And then there's the affordability aspect of it as well. It says the average annual cost for center-based infant care in Minnesota is approximately $22,000 a year. That's crazy. This ranks Minnesota as the 3rd most expensive state for infant care. So obviously affordability is a big one here. I don't know how much availability obviously they play hand in hand with each other, availability and affordability. And then the other part of it that we're going to get into with the conversation is workforce shortages. Providers are leaving due to low wages, causing long wait lists and center closures. And obviously when people can't get their children in childcare somewhere, they're not going to be participating in the workforce. That's a big part of it. That's I'm excited for the historical part of this conversation to talk about how we got here in the first place. Because I think that society has been programmed to a point where we're essentially required to have two working, like we're required to have two members of the household working in order to make it. And something happened in I think the 50s and 60s, as we maybe get to uncover some of this stuff that I think led to that. As far as, and I'm all for, like, I want to make sure that I tote this conversation appropriately, because I'm all for, like, women empowerment, women participation in the workforce, all of that. I don't want to be misheard throughout this conversation, don't label me. But I do think that's a big part of the conversation, and it doesn't have to be women, whatever. One parent at home taking care of the kid, one parent working, that concept really has shifted throughout history a little bit. So I'm curious, do you have much of a perspective on the history of childcare? Is that something that you studied at all, or have you looked into how things have come to be over time?
Yeah, I'm not like a scholar on it, but a lot of it has really evolved. And really, care work in general, whether it's young children or the elderly, has always been undervalued. I think is often seen as unskilled work, even though it's incredibly demanding and you need a lot of skills to do it well. But it's also been largely on the shoulders of women, unpaid work. We could get into all of that.
Well, historically, it was you had generations that lived together. That was a lot more common throughout history. So you'd have older generations. You'd have like a grandparent taking care of the kids. Well, maybe the mother was in more of an active role in the household as far as like preparing and cooking and cleaning, and then you had your hunters and your gatherers and all those things, right? And so society was certainly structured differently when generations stayed together and lived together. That was like, I think the first thing that you saw probably fall. But yeah, it is. It's really, unpaid work that's an interesting perspective, because if you don't have the industry, then somebody's doing that job at home and they're just doing that job at home, So, but as far as all that went, childcare was informal, primarily handled by mothers, extended family, or community members. This was pre-1800s. You had wet nurses and servants in wealthier households, especially in Europe and the colonial America, where women were often hired as wet nurses or household servants to help raise children. There was no formal childcare profession or industry. I think you would have seen the first day nursery pop up in the U.S. It would have been in 1854, the New York Nursery and Child's Hospital. So really prior to the mid-1800s, it was all family-based healthcare.
Right. And, I think there's certainly value in that. That's one model. That's one way that works for families. But the world has evolved that. And like you mentioned, I've thought a lot about my own family. Even if one of us wanted to stay home with our kids, which neither one of us wants to stay home. I love my children, but I don't want to be with them all the time. We couldn't afford to on one salary. It just isn't.
It's not feasible.
We picked low-paying professions. So even if we wanted to, and I think that's the reality for most families, even if somebody wanted to stay home, whether it's the mom or the dad or whoever, just the way things are structured, it just isn't feasible.
Right.
You just can't do it.
And that all happened because, this is so funny here, just perfect. The Industrial Revolution led to an increased demand for work, basically. So you had lower income, women from lower income families were basically forced into the workforce. That was sort of the first initial wave, really, of women entering the workforce. Began in like the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. Progressive era reform started pushing for better child welfare, influenced by growing concerns over child labor, hygiene, and education. So a lot of this too, you had, prior to childcare, you had child labor. Like,
Right.
that's what I mean, a lot of that. So
Yeah. Well, just like the way that we view childhood has really changed, and the way that,
right.
like, just, yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
You were expected, yeah. And feel free to. I mean, you were expected to work as a kid. You were expected, you weren't playing on a freaking playground. You were out in the fields picking rocks. Like, that was what you did. You, as soon as you were able to, and that goes back to the family unit and everything, but it's just very, very interesting. Kids grew up different.
Right. And, and to that, I mean, that was before, like,
we're all a bunch of
public
softies now. Nobody's picking rocks in fields anymore.
Except it's kind of funny. That's like what kids love to do. I mean, they're like called to dirt and rocks.
Yeah,
and,
it's true.
There's something like primal about it. But yeah, I know. But then too, I mean, some of that is like before there was public education too. And then as we started seeing public education, but then kids, birth to 5 have always been left out of that.
Yes.
There's kind of been this misconception that learning starts in kindergarten, which is, we know, false. 90% of brain development happens by age 5.
Wow.
And yet those first 5 years are so deeply ignored.
What percent?
90%.
No way.
85% by age 3, 90% by age 5.
And then the rest of 10% is just for the rest of your life, or what? Are you kidding me?
And then by the time you're like 26, 27, you start really pruning away, and then you start losing. You start losing in your mid-20s.
Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah. And the first 5 years, like the brain development is fascinating. The first 5 years, really the first 3 years in particular, but your brain is incredibly, it's called plastic. So there's so much opportunity to really influence kids and to set them up for success, whether that's, in their career, whatever, however you define success, but you're really laying the foundation with those social emotional skills.
Wow.
Without that foundation, it makes everything else so much harder. And then you're having to go back and like re-teach, and when their brain is already kind of set. And so you have the most opportunity to have the most positive impact in the first 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. But that really has not been well understood or appreciated. I think there's often, and we always talk, getting ready for kindergarten, they're ready to learn. By the time they get to kindergarten, they're on a trajectory.
Wow.
And not even, we're not talking academics. That kind of comes later. Really, for young children, learning is about,
like, learning how to balance your emotions.
Yeah. And I know, social emotional learning, I know, is kind of a hot topic, but it is the foundation for all other development.
Yeah.
Because if children don't have those skills, they can't self-regulate. So then you see lots of behavior issues, which then that can lead to all sorts of discipline. I mean, you can see how that plays out as kids get older, if they can't control their emotions. Right. And without that foundation, their brains are just not going to be ready to learn the academic stuff later, because they're so busy. They're so consumed with all these feelings they don't know what to do with.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. It's
interesting. Yeah. So you talk about building a better society. It has to start with childcare.
And really, I mean, it has to start and we're finding out more and more too. It even starts before kids are born. Like during pregnancy, there's a lot happening. Kids are born already having absorbed some things and learned, picked up, their brains are
obviously you hear about the big one, like fetal alcohol syndrome and stuff like that sticks with a kid. But then all of the stuff that you just don't realize too, that happens in that developmental stage for a pregnant woman. And like, I heard something about like, even like a man's sperm has a lot to do with like emotions and like develop, like there's like even like things that like the man can
always the
like, well, I'm just saying, like, it's not just like the baby in fertilization stages. It's like, it has like everything to do with like, I don't know, you're more predisposed to like diabetes if you had a high sugar intake for a certain period of years as a male or something like it. That'll just be there with you forever. So like, there's just like, I don't know. It's crazy though. All of that development. So, workforce though, that's the part of it that I'm really, we'll get to that here as we get into like the wartime era. You had like I mentioned, the reform movements, and those really were around like child labor and hygiene was like what forced like, hey, we got to figure out a better standards to like take care of these kids. Education was mentioned as well. Like, And I don't know when public education really began to rise. Do you know?
I don't know a ton about.
No? Okay.
No.
But really government involvement began in the 1930s and 1940s. You had New Deal and emergency programs. So during the Great Depression, FDR's New Deal included Works Progress Administration, the WPA, funding for emergency nursery schools, not for working mothers, but to employ teachers. And then World War II, you had the Lanham Act of 1940. With men at war and women working, the federal government created the first and only federal-funded universal child care system through the Lanham Act. Centers provided full daycare across the country. This ended abruptly in 1946.
What could have been?
Well, and this is when you get into the solutions and we get into talking about that stuff, I'm sure that like you're going to have some opinions about solutions. I will just let you know at the core, I am always for less government in our lives. Like less government control is always better, I think. But I'm interested in hearing, once we get through the history here, hearing about some of the solutions and some of the policy reform that maybe you'd like to see on a local level. Mm-hmm. If there's some things to be done on a local level for policy reform. And then maybe speculate on some things that are a little more, less in our control on the national level. But that was the first instance. It was briefly, it was from 1940 to 1946. We did have a federally funded universal child care system. And then obviously the post-war baby boom. And when you're looking at the 50s and 60s here, this is the big movement for so much stuff happened in the 60s with money, and that was really the big women's empowerment movement, the women in the workforce, really all of that started. What I think is really interesting and why I feel like this workforce, like full participation in the workforce, we've really been duped as a society, because I think it all happened with the money. Because you had silver and money before 1963. So in 1963, they took silver out of money. And then in 74, 10 years later, they went off the gold standard completely and went into a fiat currency system where we work for nothing now. And simultaneously, all of these social movements and social acts are driving full workforce participation. So now all of a sudden you've created a society where everybody has to work, or it was like they didn't have to work right away, right? It was like this money had substance to it. Money was real, and then you take away the realness of money and you make it fake, and then you convince everybody that it's that they need to be a part of this system, and then all of a sudden you devalue the currency. 50 years later, we're stuck, and that's where we're at right now. So I would have loved to have seen a world where we never went to a fiat currency system, because I think families would be in a lot healthier situations financially. They would be able to balance that work-life balance a little bit more than we're being asked to now. But nonetheless, that created the childcare industry post-world. You were looking at the war on poverty. In 1965, Head Start was launched under Lyndon B. Johnson as part of the war on poverty, providing early childhood education to low-income children, making a major federal re-entry into childcare development. I mean, nobody can argue that that's a bad thing, right? But it's just like you see it slowly kind of creating a system that's forcing everybody to work. And we'll just create another industry to take care of the kids.
And an industry that's not supported.
Right. That hasn't really been fully supported. Interesting. The feminist movement in the 70s, pressures grew as more women entered the workforce for accessible, affordable childcare. And then you saw the development of was really kind of the Wild West for childcare for a little while there, much like everything in the 70s and 80s before
Yeah.
regulations really started to kick in. And then you had the really from the 90s to 2000s were like the regulatory, the licensing madness just kind of began here. And you can probably talk about what's good and what's necessary and what needs to be there. And then maybe some things that are probably over-regulated that we need to provide a little more leniency so that we have more of this care available. I think that's an important conversation to have.
Oh, you can't talk childcare without
Yeah.
licensing. Yeah.
So, but talk about that a little bit. Minnesota particularly, it's really, really hard to even start a business as a childcare provider.
Yes.
Or the regulations, the office work have caused a significant decrease in the amount of providers we have.
Yes and no. You know, I kind of fall on the other side of it. I'm pretty pro regulation, especially, you know, and I know it's split, and it is split, you know, on licensing. That's always a hot topic. Both when I was a provider and now as a parent, I want regulations in place. Really, the regulations and licensing are the floor. They're the bare minimum things that you need to keep kids safe. They really don't get into like quality. Licensing itself is not, it's one indicator of quality, but it's not the only indicator. Like licensing really is health and safety.
Okay.
And there are the state is going, and they've been working on it for a few years, and they're in this process right now of, it's called the licensing modernization process. So they're updating licensing rules, and there's different license types. They just had the second draft of those updates come out, and they've had provider feedback. There was just an engagement session at West Central Initiative a couple weeks ago. So they are taking feedback. I'm not sure what the timeline is for the next draft. I think that'll be the final draft. And then I want to say 2027 is when the updated standards would go into effect. So there's some time there. And I do know that can be a barrier for some people, particularly, well, I shouldn't say particularly, family childcare, so like in-home childcare. But just like any other industry, we want it to be regulated for the safety of children, right? Like I'm trusting somebody with my kid 9 hours a day. Like I need to know that they're safe, all ages, but especially infants are particularly vulnerable.
Right.
You know, just with unsafe sleep is a huge thing. There's a lot that can go wrong with kids. And, even in my own, just with my own 2 kids, keeping them alive is sometimes a real challenge. And so, there is that, as a parent, I want to know that there is that kind of minimum standard in place that my kid's going to be safe. And there is always room for common sense regulation, right? And not like overly burdensome, or if there are going to be these regulations in place, having support of it. Like if you need to, like one that's being talked about right now is radon mitigation. So then having funding available, if somebody needs to go through that process, having funding available for them to access that service is really important.
Because basically what you have is, and I wish I did a lot of research here, and I wish I would have pulled the exact numbers of childcare facilities that, right here. Yeah, it says between 2000 and 2020, Greater Minnesota experienced a net loss of over 20,000 childcare spaces, despite population growth. And a lot of it too is like you're seeing a drying up of these smaller in-homes, and it's going to more of a corporate model. It's going to more of like a larger care facility model because of these. And I can't speak towards all of the details. You mentioned the radon thing being one of them, and I can only imagine that. And again, regulations obviously to a point are necessary. Like certainly when you're dealing with infant care, elderly care, like care of people, those are like the industries that should be regulated the most, but also the industries that are struggling the most on the office on the managing the office front side of things, keeping up with regulations. You have people fearing to enter this industry because of lawsuits. You have a bunch of things on the regulatory side that are causing pain in the industry, right? I mean, that is like, you can't just say that the government regulations haven't made it, like, they have made it more difficult than not for people, for in-home providers. And so you're seeing a shift with a lot of in-home care being shut down and more of it going to a larger company model.
In some cases, it's not really true in rural Minnesota.
Okay.
It's certainly not true in Fergus. Part of it, though, is it's not so, and again, it's not so much the regulation, is that it's under-resourced. There aren't enough people who can help with some of that, like that office work, that paper. There's a lot of paperwork involved. And often, especially in home providers, it's just them. But part of that, too, and part of why it's under-resourced at that level and why people can't pay or aren't making a living wage is because childcare isn't subsidized in the same way that K-12 education is subsidized. K-12 education is just as expensive to deliver and should be subsidized. I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but I'm saying birth to 5 should also be subsidized in that same way, because that's why you get into parents are paying this incredible amount of money for childcare. And so there's sometimes a misconception that providers are making a ton of money. They're not. All of that money, just about all that money, goes back into their program. It's very low wages. And so that's part of why you see people leaving the field too. It's not sustainable. That's why I left the field. I was a childcare provider out of college. And it was okay when it was just me for a little bit, but then at a certain point I couldn't make my student loan payments with what I was making. And even now, we've talked about if I wanted to do childcare in our home, we couldn't sustain that just because the wages aren't high enough. So that's part of why you see people leaving too. It's just you don't get paid enough. You often don't have benefits, even if you're at a larger employer, because there's no outside subsidy. Well, there's some scholarships and there's some things like that, but it's not wide scale in the way that K-12 education is. And so that's why you see a lot, and K-12 education is struggling too. Not saying that that's a perfect system, but really, and these are the conversations we've been having kind of with these community stakeholders too, is that the business model is not sustainable without some sort of outside investment. It just is not going to work. It's not going to work for parents. It's not going to work for the childcare providers themselves. And it's not going to work for the community too.
So with Minnesota already being a top 5 tax state, what's the answer? Because the answer can't be taxing people more. You have to look at where the money is and where it doesn't belong and figure out a way to put it to better use. I mean, because that's really, and that's every conversation. Whenever you want to talk about adding a government subsidy or doing anything else, the answer is really, where does the money come from? Because it's not the tax pool. Well, that is the answer, but at the end of the day,
you could look at how
we're already in a top 5 tax state. And so at the end of the day, that seems like a solution to create a new system. It may be necessary, but probably not what a lot of people want to hear.
No, it's not what they want to hear, but I've been pretty frank in conversation. Without money, it is not going to happen. And so these conversations too, we've been happening. So I can circle back a little bit to my work with the city in particular. Part of my role is convening this group. It's called the Rural Childcare Innovation Program, or RCCIP. The City of Fergus Falls participated in it a couple of years ago, 2022. It was this 18-month program facilitated by an organization called First Children's Finance, which is they're a national organization. They're based out of the Twin Cities. They really look at the business side of childcare, both for providers and businesses as well as communities. They do all sorts of things. And this RCCIP process brings together communities to look at how do we address childcare issues in our community. And so there was a group of probably about 20, 25 stakeholders that participated in this original process from, there were people from the early childhood world, from childcare. We had city council members, we had the school, we had faith leaders, all sorts of people. I'm not thinking of healthcare. We had some business representatives there as well, and really worked through and talked about some of these issues, like the affordability, the access, all of these challenges, and what are we as a community going to do about it? And so during that process, we developed 6 goals. and kind of worked through them. And then towards the end of that process, there were some staffing changes at First Children's Finance, which led to that work kind of petering out. We just didn't really have a point person to keep us going. And so things just kind of stalled out. There were still pockets of activity happening, but it really sat dormant for about a year.
What were the 6 points that you guys were gonna? Do you have those?
I do. It's
I'd be curious.
It was pretty ambitious, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah. But this is all kind of probably playing into the work that you're doing now then.
Right.
So
yeah,
you're trying to kind of pick up on some of these initiatives now
Yep.
then. Okay.
Yeah. So that's really been a big focus, particularly with the city, is kind of reviving this work and revisiting some of the goals. Some of these goals are things that I'm just doing in my capacity as a childcare project manager now. A big reason why this work doesn't get moved forward is because there isn't anybody who's dedicated to it. Childcare is a little piece of a lot of people's work. And so it's really hard to move some of these projects forward. And so fortunately there was some funding that is allowing me to do this for a short term. It's a grant, so it's not.
Right. How long is this contract for?
If I make it through the end of the year, maybe.
Okay.
6 months-ish.
Oh, okay.
So it's pretty short term. So we've got a lot to do in 6 months, or however long. But so really I'm trying to move some of this forward. It's just things that I can do. And then now we've reconvened. Probably about half the original group is either not in their role anymore. They're not in the community anymore. Like, things have changed. So we brought new people in. We just met last month. We kind of reconvened a group to talk about a lot of this stuff and like the work that has been done, the challenges. And now we're meeting again next week to feel like, okay, how do we move this forward? What are our goals for the next, 3 to 6 months? What's our goal for the next, in 2 years, where do we want to be? In 5 years, where do we want to be? Trying to make it a little more sustainable work so that we're not constantly having to like reinvent this plan. Anyway, that's my goal that I'm working on. But so really and these goals were developed, the original goals as well as the ones we're working on now were developed from a lot of feedback, like lots of conversations. We had town hall meetings. We got feedback from childcare providers, from families, all sorts of stuff. And really, so the goals that we developed originally were about adding new facilities, like building new facilities, figuring out some like consultation work. So if there was like a business that wanted to start a childcare program in their business, in their office.
So that's an interesting, I want to get back to that topic, but I want to go off on a little bit of a side conversation, because that's a fascinating one for me. Like, we want you to be an enslaved in our workforce so badly that we're willing to watch your kids for you. You can drop them off and you can drop them off right here. Look how happy. But then right there, then it's nice too, because your kid's there. You can maybe go see them on lunch, maybe have lunch with them. But it's kind of creepy and it's kind of weird when you realize what kind of society we're building right now. Yeah, I'm just gonna. That's my take on that whole we'll watch your kids for you right here where you work.
As a parent, like the convenience of that is so incredible. Nice. And assuming people have some autonomy over where they're working. I hope that people are doing work that they find fulfilling. And
yes,
that,
that's really what it always comes back to and comes down to with workforce and with we get the opportunity to work in one of the best economies in the world as far as opportunity goes, to be able to make it and to be able to make something happen. It's not without its pitfalls, for sure. Right. We certainly all have numerous things that we could complain about here in the United States, and policies and our president and all this stuff, I'm sure, but at the end of the day, we have a lot of opportunity here, a lot more opportunity than the rest of the world. And hopefully people are, living a life that fulfills them and not feeling like they're trapped in a 9-to-5 that they hate, certainly doing work that, is meaningful to you is the most important thing in the world. And so hopefully as we shift into a society where, we're forced to participate in the workforce and not, spending all that time with your kids or spending the time that previous generations would have invested or spent with their families. Hopefully we find the proper balance there, and maybe in work, maybe this in work childcare is one of those initiatives that society just kind of needs to figure out how to work out. Maybe that's something that they just need to figure out how to work out. So pick back up on that list there. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, so there's looking at, how do we support, whether it's a business or whether it's somebody that wants to become a provider, how do we support them? Like what resources do we have? A couple of the goals are related to kind of like marketing and outreach. Kind of what I'm doing here is like talking to, different audiences. Obviously it'll be a different message, but like sharing what is the need in our community and helping people understand that. What is the need for families? What do providers need? What do businesses need? All of that. And also one thing, as I've gone through this, I've really thought about, I think those of us kind of doing this work have done a really good job, especially the last, I think COVID really kind of sped things up. We've done a really good job of educating everything that's not working and telling people like, this is the crisis that we're in, which is super important. We have not done a great job of lifting up what is working or the providers that are doing great work. There are incredible providers out there, and we haven't done a great job of celebrating those successes.
Yeah.
And so that's something as we're kind of revisiting this work, wanting to do more of that, of lifting up all the good work that is happening, because there's great work happening. And so it's finding that balance of like, we need to be honest about what isn't working and figure out how do we solve for that. But at the same time, recognizing all the good stuff that is happening and how we continue that.
Yeah. So what are the good things that we have to show for ourselves here in Fergus Falls? Like what is working in our community for childcare?
I mean, some of it are just individual providers. We have fantastic providers. My youngest son is starting at a new provider in 2 weeks, and we've visited a couple times, and I just already know like she's doing incredible work. Like there are just those individual providers, or if they're working at a center or a Head Start, these incredible, mostly women, that really pour themselves into this work.
What's the statistics? How many men run daycare out there?
Very few.
Very few.
And I mean, there's a lot of
few.
And it kind of gets back to
would you bring your child to a daycare facility run by him? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to you. It's all just
Yeah. Which I wish there were more men. I mean, but part of it goes back to we as a society don't value caregiving work in the same way that we value other skills. There's a lot of,
which is crazy, knowing that it's the most valuable thing that society has. Like it's one of the most that is crazy. It's actually insane. I'm learning this now, how crazy this is.
When you really stop to think about it. But there's a lot of things that play into that. And I mean, so there's some work to do of just shifting the understanding of care work is not soft work. It's really, really hard work,
right,
and incredibly skilled. But we don't pay people the same that we pay in other highly skilled professions. And there's a lot of attitudes. And
so is that what's not working?
That's what's not working. Yes. So yes, it's so easy though to fall back into that. But I do think there is. So I guess it's this flip side of that. There is this kind of sense of urgency among people that there wasn't a few years ago. Like, this is a real issue and we need to solve this. So I think some of it is this messaging is working and people are really starting to hear and understand and be invested in a new way. So that's, kind of the flip side of that. But there's great work happening. And I think just the fact that there's this group of stakeholders and, most of them in the room don't have young kids. They're past the point where that's maybe impacting their lives, but they deeply care about it for different reasons. They're coming at it from different reasons. So just the fact that it's become a community issue feels really positive to me that there is some of this recognition. And a lot of it's driven from economic development needs, which isn't necessarily my perspective that I come at it from, but that doesn't mean it's not that if that's
right.
an entry point for people, I'm more.
I mean, that's absolutely one of the points here is the economic impact, because of we need workforce participation.
Right.
We need workforce participation. That's all there is to it. And so, It's interesting that, but that's not necessarily your focus on it.
I mean, this specifically this work with the RCCIP really is an economic development lens. And so that's a lot of this, my own personal reasons for doing this work doesn't come from that. But you can't have that conversation without it, because it gets back to things aren't going to change without an outside investment. And that's really where a lot of these economic development conversations come in, is how can, whether it's a community, whether it's an individual business, how can these groups invest in childcare, and what does that look like? So that's part of this group too, and there's lots of different solutions. There's not going to be one solution. Like, there isn't going to be a childcare solution in Fergus Falls. There's going to be lots of childcare solutions. And so figuring out how to connect people to the solution that works for them.
Right.
So we talk about, it's largely family childcare in Fergus Falls, in home care. And so we want to sustain and increase. We've lost quite a few providers in the last few years, some of it due to COVID. I mean, lots of different reasons. So we want to sustain those current providers, and how do we support them so they stay
COVID
in the
was a
field?
big one, because guess what? More regulations. And well,
but on the flip side, there was an infusion of relief dollars too that really helped a lot of things during COVID. And now a lot of that relief funding has gone. So now we're like, what do we do?
The economy is really feeling the pain of the temporary Band-Aid that was slapped on it to get people by, because the businesses that were supposed to fail then didn't, because we didn't allow them to, because it didn't feel right to allow them to. And now it feels okay to allow them to. I mean, I guess, right? I mean,
right. Yeah.
Interesting.
So there's some of that too. I think and none of this stuff is new, but I think we're feeling it again in the last few, just as that relief funding has gone away. And it's, now there was this, not surplus of cash, but more money than there had been to support this work. And now that money's gone, or it will be gone. And so now, and it's not just in Fergus Falls, it's not just in Minnesota, nationwide, trying to figure out, okay, how do we recover from this? How do we move forward? And there's no simple answer to it. But
what are, I guess, I assume solutions and innovations, that's like one of your points there. Like, what are we looking at for like things that are being done around here now? Like, if there's a solution or if there's innovations that you can make in your time here in this position, like what's happening specifically in Fergus Falls or Otter Tail County here?
Yeah. So one kind of project that I didn't start, I'm just supporting, and that we're supporting in this work is Pioneer. They started Pioneer Kids a couple of years ago. So it's an on-site. It's a family childcare license. So it's like an in-home program, but it's at one of their memory care cottages. And it's for their staff, their employees. Fantastic provider out there. They're looking to expand. Part of it, they had these open memory care units because they had a staffing shortage, and now they don't so much have a staffing shortage anymore. So now they need this memory care unit back, which is great for Pioneer. And so now they're having these conversations. There's a partnership. There's Habitat for Humanity is involved. The city's at the table, the county's at the table, looking at building and expanding their program, both for their employees, but then they're also looking at, if they were to build some additional space, could they contract that out to another provider to move a program in, or maybe work with another business or organization? So it's still, there's a group that meets monthly right now that's talking about that work, and they're still kind of figuring out plans and all of that. But that's moving ahead. Pioneer has really been kind of a leader in that space. Of they saw this need, and they had space they could use, and have really done a lot of work and have been really great champions just in the community. And so that's, one example of something that is going well. And so now just looking at how can we support that effort. And I think that work will, I think especially this summer, there's going to be more kind of concrete next steps with that project. So they're at the table, but then we're also looking at, there are several other kind of business and nonprofit partners that want to support their employees. And so we're trying to figure out what are solutions. It could be One example that we sometimes see is that businesses will pay to reserve like 4 spots at a program for their employees. Or maybe they have kind of a stipend that they give to their employees. They can offer it like as a benefit. There's different ways to structure that. So that's one model that's pretty popular that we're trying to figure out. How do we match up the right people? We're also talking about, can there be, if there's like adopt a class in the school, can there be a adopt a childcare program where, you can maybe sponsor a program or a classroom with supply, whatever they might need. There's also some other communities. It hasn't happened in Fergus yet, but there's one in Becker County. There's one in Clay County where they have they have different names, but it's like an early childhood fund that people can contribute to, and then they give out grants to providers. So if there's lots of different solutions. It's right now we're at a point of we have a lot of ideas, and so how do we kind of narrow it down? Because if we have like 50 ideas, we can't get all that done in 6 months.
It's almost like I feel like this crisis has kind of, and we talked about obviously with the in work provided, but it's almost like it's going to end up being in an employment benefit category. Mm-hmm. Like that's the kind of shift if we're talking about, more of a, and I'm not like, I don't want to sound like I'm like some big capitalist person or anything, but like if we're talking about more of like a less government, mm-hmm. more people-based mm-hmm. solution, I think that seeing something like that as an employment benefit mm-hmm. or something like that may potentially set employers apart as far as being more, I really want to work for this company because mm-hmm. I know they're going to take care of me and my family.
Oh yeah, it's a huge incentive.
So I am really curious about those solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Those intrigue me for sure. And so your job is figuring out how to connect the dots between mm-hmm. a business who wants to help provide this and the realities of them mm-hmm. being able to do so. And then as far as like the structure of our community, do we have a shortage here in Fergus Falls? Is a mass shortage?
Yeah, Fergus is probably the community with the biggest shortage in Otter Tail County right now. It's kind of shifted throughout the years of which community has the biggest shortage, and right now it's Fergus. There's a shortage and there's some new data coming out this month actually, but as of last June, it was about 400 slots short. Wow. Just in Fergus. And I would suspect it's maybe higher than that now. So yeah, Fergus is in a kind of a tough spot.
And then and the realities of we haven't even got into the sad realities about what happens when kids don't have care. Mm-hmm. Like whether they're being left at home alone, or you hear stories about kids being left in cars. Mm-hmm. You hear, the 6-year-old is watching the 8-year-old or the 4-year-old or whatever, like a whole number of things that like, are just like, ooh, like, so solving the problem is very important because there's probably a lot of terrible, terrible, terrible things happening in our community as a result of those 400 children not having care.
Well, there's that. And then, you can zoom out even further. There are a lot of kids that aren't in childcare because that is a choice that works for their family, whether they have a parent staying home or they have, whoever. Wherever kids are, we want them to be safe and well. And so, childcare is one piece of that, but then also we're looking at how are we supporting caregivers, whether it's a childcare provider or a parent. I certainly, before I had kids, I was the perfect parent before I had kids because, and now that I have kids, and it's like, it feels impossible most days. And my husband and I are incredibly privileged. Like I look at, we have health insurance, we have stable housing, we have reliable transportation, we have family that can help. So like we lost childcare 2 months ago. Not ideal, but we could make it work. We have all of these things and it still feels like, we're still paycheck to paycheck. Like it feels impossible. Yeah. And so, you just hate, like, we don't support families enough, period. And so finding these ways to make families, and that's beyond the scope of this work, but that's really what I get excited about is how are we as a community caring for everybody, but how are we caring for caregivers?
Yeah.
Because caring, whether they're little people or they're, elderly people, that's really hard work. And then if you've got your own maybe mental health struggles, trying to take care of a child is going to be really hard because you're just trying to keep yourself well.
Yeah.
And the same is true for childcare providers. It's incredibly exhausting work. The rate of burnout is really high. I mean, then we can get into mental health issues too. And I mean, they're beyond the scope of this.
Yeah.
But
it's all relevant to the conversation. It's all relevant because it creates a snowball effect, and like one domino falls and everything kind of, you see the results of it all throughout, certainly the school system is a huge, I didn't realize that by the time they entered the school system, they were already basically fully a lot of their emotions are already set, and you're fighting against everything that has been set for the first 5 years. That's crazy. That is, it's wild. So, anything else that you can think of that like local businesses, community members, can do to contribute, or is there like a policy shift that you'd like to see? Obviously, you're contracted with the city. You're not an elected official, but is there some work that we can do in local legislation to alleviate some of this stuff?
That is something, the part of kind of this work, we're looking at some of those solutions, and whether it's, at the city level or the county level, trying to get some examples from other communities. There might be some tax abatement things, or, there might be some of those solutions that I am not knowledgeable enough to really speak on, but I do think there are things out there. But I think just being part of the conversation is huge. I've just been really, really, really pleased with who has stepped forward and who's wanting to do this work, and having some really honest conversations about the challenges of it. And I think, like we were just talking about, there's sometimes some frustration. There's this feeling of like, why haven't we solved this already? But it's so complex, and you pull on one thing and then there's this whole other unintended consequence. And so trying to figure out like, what is a systemic approach that it's just like, how do we make this a cohesive, as all encompassing plan as we can? And so I think helping people just understand that this work, I've been thinking a lot about, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's going to take a lot of different people and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to figure something out. But I think just stepping up is huge, and then being willing to have those conversations and being willing to brainstorm of like, hey, maybe we could support in this way, or really that's kind of where we're at, is just looking for people to be part of the conversation and be willing to contribute their ideas and their time, because I think it's going to take a lot of people working together to move things forward. And so I think just being part of the conversation is huge.
So who's working on this stuff? You mentioned there was some stuff that kind of got put on the back burner until you kind of picked it up again here. But like let's say fast forward 2026, January 2026, let's just say your contracts are done with the county and the city. Who's continuing that work, or what goes on beyond that then?
That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out, is like, how do we set this up so that, if there isn't somebody who can be dedicated to this work, that it's kind of self-sustaining.
Right.
And I haven't figured that out yet. That's my goal for June, is to figure out like, how do I do this without me being here? Right. Or it's like, how do we kind of create this plan? Like, how do we make a really clear plan so that it can be picked up by somebody, and maybe, it's maybe not their full-time job, but it's kind of one piece of it. And so how is it manageable enough that it can be carried forward? So I'm trying to figure that out, of like, how do we make this, how do we make sure this work continues and doesn't stop and start and stop and start? Yeah. And I haven't figured that out yet.
And that's a big one to solve. And that's maybe something that I would hope the city, and I would hope there's other people thinking about that too, besides just, one and done. We have this contract, we're going to do this thing. And then I would hope that there's maybe some thoughts or conversations going into sustaining this. Cause I mean, you could put in a lot of work here over the next few months, over the next 6-9 months or whatever. And we've seen work get put in, we've seen work get put in and then it get undone very quickly before in this community. And so it's important. It's important that if we're investing this and we're doing this as a community, it's important that we're hearing the ideas and implementing some of the change that we need to see as a result of this. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, Katie.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. This stuff gets me fired up. So
yeah, no, it was good. I mean, I enjoy it. And I would have loved to have got more into the regulatory side of things. I didn't do quite as much research as I wish I would have on like some of those, because I'm big. I fully believe that we've created a system, and I wish I could speak to the details of how just over-regulation makes it so difficult to do business. But it's important to make sure kids are safe.
Well, and I will say there is a process right now. The state is accepting feedback right now on the second draft of.
Okay.
So if there are folks out there that it's a long document, but they are accepting feedback.
They're accepting feedback. I've given mine on this microphone today. No, just kidding. But I guess, is there a way, if a community member or somebody heard this and they're like, I really would love to talk to her about this, or I'd love to get in touch and maybe I can help her with this a little bit, how can they do that? What's the best way?
Probably the best way is probably my email. Or, if you contact like the city too, they can get you in touch with me. But my email, it's just my name. So it's just Katie Ganoe 14@gmail.com.
There we go. Love
I'm
it.
like a little nervous about that. I do.
I can tell you were like, I'm a little hesitant to put my personal email. I get enough. It's like you don't get enough spam. If you've had that email address since 2014,
I did create a separate one. It is a different,
So you've got some spam in that inbox for sure.
I will say too, just one other thing. One thing that has come out of this already is that on the city website, there is a new tab. So if you go to community development on the city website, there's a childcare resources section now. And so there's a section for providers, and then there's a section for families as well. So there's resources about paying for childcare. There are some scholarships out there. How to find childcare. There's a childcare locator app, things like that. So that is a new thing on the city website as of last week, I think.
Awesome.
So
cool. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for your time. Appreciate your time here and the work you're doing. Best of luck to you and your family. Good luck to Nick. He's got this Battle of the Bands thing he wanted me to talk about, so I'd be sure to throw it in here at the end of the episode. But you'll find it. You can find it in the episode description. There's a Battle of the Bands. I'm a big supporter of local music, so anything we can do to get a little recognition for the Wintersloth, let's make it happen.
Yes. Go to their social media. They've got all their
stuff. They've got it
there.
all there.